Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, where we explore the histories and movements that shape the Caribbean and its global connections. Today's episode turns our attention to migration, one of the defining experiences of Caribbean life, but also one of the most maybe misunderstood when viewed through narrow geographic and political frameworks. Too often, migration in the Americas is discussed through a single lens that could be, centered on the U.S. border, south to north movements or north to south movements. Caribbean and Latin American mobility has always been far more complex, marked by intra-regional migration, circular movement, east to west movements, layered histories of displacement shaped by colonialism, labor demands, environmental change, racial formation, and I could certainly keep going. But in this episode, I'm joined by my co-editors of a book that I am very proud to have been part of and putting together. We are so glad to have back on Strictly Facts Dr. Lewis, who some of our earlier listeners might remember having joined us in the past, as well as Dr. Kristen Kolenz to discuss our new book, Unbordering Migration Studies in the Caribbean and Latin America. Dr. Lewis is the research professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Brown University, whose work focuses on political science and history with an emphasis on Caribbean regionalism, development, regional trade agreements, and international trade. And Dr. Kolenz is an assistant professor of international studies at Centre College, whose research focuses on grassroots resistance to state violence with specific emphases on the potential of community practices through decolonial and transnational feminisms. Our volume brings together scholars and artists across disciplines and regions to rethink how we study migration by decentering the United States and foregrounding the diverse spaces, identities, and histories that have long been overlooked. Together, we'll reflect on the collaborative process of putting this book together, why new scholarship on Caribbean and Latin American migration is so important right now, and how reimagining borders can help us better understand movement, belonging, and identity across the Americas. So thank you both for joining me. Great to have you back, Dr. Lewis, and great to have you, Dr. Kolenz. I'll first allow each of you to maybe tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and what brought you to this work on Caribbean migration studies and Latin American migration studies.
Thank you, Alexandria. Yeah, my interest in migration studies really comes out of my interest with the Caribbean development challenges. And in that context, I looked at the migration of skilled folk, primarily nurses and teachers, to North America and Britain. And I looked at it more from the perspective of development challenges, brain drain, and the proposal at the time, encouraging the migration of nurses in particular, was projected as a development strategy because it brought remittances. And basically, being very critical of that approach to migration. So that is the context in which my own interest in migration developed. But in terms of this specific project, I would say that originated in a Mellon Foundation grant that we managed to secure when I was director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at Brown. And I worked in collaboration with Professor Tony Boakes, who was director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, which is now the Ruth Simmons Center, and Professor Brian Meeks, who was chair of the Africana Studies Department at Brown. And the purpose of this project was to not just shift the attention. I mean, the migration at that time had become highly publicized as crisis. You had North African migrants coming to the Mediterranean, and you had caravans of people from Central America crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, and everywhere it was projected as a crisis. So we wanted to shift the focus from migration as crisis to thinking about migration outside of those, highly politicized and publicized spaces, to look more at what was happening within our region. And Latin America and the Caribbean had actually grown in significance as a place for the movement of people. I mean, historically, the region is founded on migration, right? And that hasn't changed. Migration is very much part of, continuing migration of the regional experience. In terms of looking at Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a lot of things happening. Increasingly more movement within the region, but movement back from North America to the region. But also, you had two really huge movements of people. First, Haitian migrants, particularly after the 2010 earthquake, and then as economic collapse and political instability and political collapse became more dominant, then, Haitian migration became a focus. And then that was surpassed by the migration of Venezuelans as the Venezuelan economy collapsed and parties collapsed under pressure from the US government. So that's where that came up. There's a lot happening outside of North America and Europe when it comes to thinking about migration.
Thanks, Alexandria, for having us. It's really fun to be back together. This was kind of a long road, as these kinds of works always are, but it was a really cool opportunity to work with the two of you, especially because my work isn't focused on the Caribbean. Mine is focused on Central America, and really in particular Guatemala and Central Americans in migration. So it was fun for me to kind of put myself a little bit outside my own, not just like disciplinary kind of comfort zone, but also regional comfort zone, to think critically about how we can move the center of conversations about migration away from, like, especially kind of the US-Mexico border crossing, and to think about the really interesting histories and futures of migration that is intra-regional when we think about Latin America and the Caribbean. So like you said, my work looks at kind of grassroots responses to state violence and what people are doing to talk back. And so my involvement in the seminar, like Patsy said earlier, and in this project was rooted in my work with art created by immigrants who are held inside Stewart Detention Center, which is an ICE facility in Southwest Georgia. So I'm really excited to have my own chapter in the book that focuses on some of that work, and the exhibit I was able to curate with the support of the Sawyer seminar during my time as a research associate at Brown. And I've continued to be able to work on that project and work on it with my students here in Kentucky. So it's been a really cool way to jumpstart this work and to now come back and celebrate kind of its origin in this really cool collaboration with scholars who focus on regions all over the hemisphere.
Definitely. Thank you both so much. Just to sort of give our listeners a little bit more context, because as Kristen said, this has definitely been a long time coming. So after Dr. Lewis was able to secure the Mellon Sawyer Seminar grant, Kristen and I joined as part of this collaborative effort in 2021 to 2022, if I'm not mistaken, which seems wild that it was so long ago, but also doesn't feel that long ago. Dr. Kolenz joined Brown as our postdoc, and I was the graduate assistant, and was able to support our efforts from sort of a student perspective. The whole year culminated in terms of some of the work that we did. As Kristen mentioned, we had this exhibit that she put together given her work with Student Detention Center, as well as two conferences that we put on. And this is really where the crux of, some of our work from this book comes together. So people from, all over the world. We had two conferences. One was fully remote online because, as our listeners can imagine, this was COVID times. And then we also had one that was dually enabled, both virtually, and some of those joined us in person. And I think, from me as a grad student at the time, and I think still navigating what my interests are, of course, as our listeners are sure, I'm obviously interested in Caribbean history. But I think being able to be part of this project, and overall the Sawyer seminar on a whole helped me to really push my considerations, I think, in terms of what my interests are in Caribbean history. Migration, as Dr. Lewis mentioned, is of course a big part of who we are as a people, my own family's history in general. But I think being able to see how when we put together various things like migration with economies, with women's history, and, the list can go on, we all come together in terms of different points of view, in terms of what we study. I think this conversation is really important and this book is really important because, as we can perhaps allude to and talk a little bit more about, there are some gaps, I think, certainly, as we also alluded to in terms of studying migration. I think, as we all said, the big one has been there's sort of this focus on US and Mexico in terms of migration studies, and there could be a lot of reasons for that. We might not necessarily have time to get into all of those. But what do you all maybe see as some of these gaps, and how do we intend to maybe make a change or, create some leeway in terms of conversations in migration studies with the premise of Unbordering Migration Studies, our book?
So, like, the idea of addressing the disproportionate amount of attention on, like, certain issues related to migration, like you said, Alexandria, the border and the US-Mexico dynamics, like, that was kind of like an impulse for us, I think. And like Patsy said earlier, we're, like, concerned with, especially, like, media attention on the idea of crisis, over defining the ways that people were moving across the hemisphere. And so the concept of unbordering that comes out of, like, a series of conversations about, like, how do we give this book a name, which I think is the hardest part of doing any project, is titling it. How do you boil it down into one concept? But I'm really kind of proud of having come to the idea of unbordering, because it is a little bit artful, but it also, I think, emphasizes that we're trying to offer frameworks for thinking differently about really, like, any global issues, but in particular migration, because we've kind of prompted the authors to think about their work through the lens of how it, like, opens up a new pathway that takes us away from like, centering, I think, the global north in particular, and centering the ways that we think about humans and human mobility from the global north. For example, I'm thinking about Lucila Yamkis's essay, and her chapter is about mobilities between Buenos Aires and, like, the kind of rural areas of Argentina and Paraguay. And so in her essay, like, we're thinking about movement from the rural to the urban, and a lot of that movement is actually sort of, like, southward. And then she's thinking about the ways that people kind of, like, bring their memories into the construction of their new homes in really difficult places. So her chapter, I think, is really emblematic of the ways that we try to think differently about what a border encloses, what a border means. And we are trying to urge the authors that we are in community with, and now the readers of the anthology, to, I would say, think about what migrants and immigrants construct, whether that's in a social context, whether it's thinking about the environment like Lucila did in her chapter, or whether it's more focused on, like, the social world or the legal world. The different chapters are touching on these different areas of human life through the lens of migration and what migrants produce, what migrants theorize, outside of the context of just how are they getting to the US and how are they leaving the US.
Absolutely. In the title of the book, Caribbean and Latin American migration, we wanted to have more conversations, that included the Caribbean with part of that broader discussion about migration, because the regions tend to be treated separately, as if there is no interconnectedness. And there are lots of points of connections which we were deliberately trying to bring out. And even if all the articles don't have that, kind of trans Caribbean, Latin American, Central American migration quality to it, by putting these different case studies almost together, it gives you a more complex sense of what is happening in that broader region. And Kristen commented on different ways of thinking of migration and the experiences that migrants have. But I'm thinking about one of our chapters by Natalie Dietrich Jones that speaks about Venezuelans in Curaçao. And, the complexity of having a kind of relationship short of full independence, which brings up the question of who is responsible for borders, whether it's the dependent territory or the kingdom, but also speaking to longer movements of migration between Venezuelans and Curacao and the communities that exist there that tend to get these longer histories, which also came up in Shalene Gomez's article, chapter on Trinidad and Trinidadians' contemporary reaction to Venezuelan migrants, that suggests that there are longer histories of migrations that can get lost in this contemporary focus that is highly politicized. So I think that we really think that there's a lot more to looking at migration through historical lenses, looking at migration in terms of race, like who gets to move, like Mimi Sheller's wonderful article, which looks at the question of mobility and immobility and how Haitians experience migration and closure. So I think there's a lot. Those are just a few examples of some of the different kinds of ways. Monica DeHart has a really interesting article of Chinese migration in Central America and what happens when geopolitics comes into play and countries shift their formal diplomatic relations from Taiwan to China. And we see that actually has an effect on the different Chinese associations and how they move forward. So a story that's not necessarily seen as part of a migration dynamic. So I just think that this is just a small suggestion of what is possible when we think about migration beyond these points of crisis and illegality and legality that, dominates the media now.
You guys both provided a bit of a snapshot on a few of our chapters, but especially for me as a student, being able to be in the room in these conversations, right? Sort of the majority of the narrative is always the quote unquote developed world, or developing world rather, moving to the quote unquote developed world. And that's usually the story about migration and oftentimes the influx of whatever needs are then put on the developed world for having taken in, or of course gets very complicated in terms of the politics around migration. But I think what for me was really a standalone from this collection and our ability to put this together is that it not only decentered, of course, these quote unquote more dominant countries or colonial, neo-colonial developed countries, but also I think really humanized migration in ways that I don't think is often at the center, right? Stories, especially today, are talking about taxes and, how this inhibits, the structures of certain countries and what are they going to do without also realizing that migrants are people, right? And I feel like that might be a simple statement to make, but it's really not when we actually understand the complexities of what we've been able to put together in this work. And I think that sort of brings me to my next question, because a lot of our contributors approached this topic of migration studies from various perspectives, right? We've got works that are certainly historical, we've got works that are artistic, we have works that are kind of economic even, but also literature focused. There's a broad range, I think, beyond just the scope of people focusing on different countries or different regions. And so how do you feel like, we sort of attempted to balance or create balance from these diverse voices while still maintaining a cohesive intellectual framework for the volume?
I think the lesson there is that you can't just, well, you can, but I think there's also a richness in listening to different ways in which people think about migration, different disciplinary perspectives, right? I mean, the idea that you can use literature, as Esteban Lustino's really, really fascinating chapter, looking at return migration of MS-13 members and looking at that through literary lens, looking at that question through lens of film, and coming up with some real insights about what motivates people. You have that alongside Alyssa Trott's article that looks at something completely different, right? How governments, despite the idea that they are removing border restrictions, are actually policing how women move across borders, which, gives you, I think, a richer perspective. And for me, it really opened me up to thinking about migration differently. Kristen's photo essay, right? And the personal ambitions and pain and, desires that brings out. Tanya's, documenting caballeros as signs, symbols of hope and support as people transition across, hostile terrain to move to new places. I think that bringing together that, it's just so rich. And how we organize the volume, we looked at the range of incredible papers over 2 conferences. Of course, we are constrained by the size. There are lots of, really brilliant authors we couldn't invite because, we had limitations on how much we can actually put in a volume. We tried, I think, initially, at least my feel was to get as wide a geographical spread and range of issues. I think that was what initially drove my eye, but then discovering, and of course, we would have discovered this through the conference itself, the different ways and different theoretical approaches or disciplinary approaches that people took. And, keeping an eye that these were also included. There were a couple of papers that we would have liked that ended up not, making it into the volume. But that just happens with every volume.
I just want to recognize that I think the way that this book was able to come together, it really reflects Patsy's vision for the Sawyer seminar as a whole. And I want to take a minute to just celebrate what it takes for a scholar to displace their own expertise and show such generosity in inviting new people to think alongside her. And I think Patsy, for me, has become a really important mentor in my professional career because of that. You can hear just in the way that we're talking about the book and our own work, how different our perspectives are. And Patsy hired me to work on this project out of a lot of applicants, I'm sure, because it was a great job. It sounded like a lot of fun. And at first, I think we sort of struggled to find our common ground because we don't have a ton of common ground in terms of our disciplinary focus, our regional focus. But I think that what we both found, and maybe what Patsy was able to see when she was putting all of this work together, was that we have a shared vision of wanting to think critically but differently, broadly but really seriously and specifically at the same time, about how we can kind of come together around these serious issues that are shaping our world and to do something that matters from academic spaces. And for me, Patsy has become a model of humility and of generosity in creating a space where we can't control it because we don't talk about those places or those issues or those disciplines or those methods. And this book I think, expresses what's possible when scholars are willing to kind of step aside and be a part of a conversation that doesn't center them. And that's a really important message, I think, for any field of study, but especially migration studies right now, when all we hear every day is about how terrible and violent things are. What we need is fresh, open, generous, and humble perspectives to think through how things can change for us in the world.
I just want to say that we always knew that we wanted to have artistic expression, right? And the whole project, the whole Sawyer seminar, we brought film, we talked about film and literature, but Kristen really brought some very concrete connections to the arts, right? And also an insistence that this has to be part. I mean, we were open, so it wasn't like it was a lot. But Kristen brought a well-known Guatemalan feminist performer, Rebecca Lane, to the project, and she was in person. The first event we had in person after a year of, meeting online. She also mobilized groups in Mexico and other parts of Latin America to do a Zoom performance when we could not meet. And it became very important to be able to express some of that in the book. And the book opened with a poem by Danger A.K., right? Which, again, we have to tell, he was one of the people who performed on Zoom. And we were really grateful that Kristen followed up with his agent so that we can get that important quotation from one of his songs to open our book.
And I think like Alexandra's role in the seminar too had a lot to do with that, because I'm not like a music person. I think I study music and I care about music politically. But I think that like Alexandria's like focus on culture and the importance of culture was like a huge part of keeping us centered on, I think, like some of the joyful aspects of what that means and not just some of the like politically important aspects of what that means. It was really a cool collaboration between the three of us, and I'm glad to have had this at the beginning of my career, because it really has reminded me of like what this is even for.
I agree. And I think the scope of what we were able to put together conference-wise maybe doesn't fully translate, because as Dr. Lewis mentioned, you can't capture everything in the book. But we also had Gerline Joseph, who is the founder of the Haitian Bridge Alliance, who was also part of our conferences.
We kind of captured her representation as part of the conference in the introduction to the book. And we worked really hard to figure out how we could bring her into like onto the pages, because her presentation, her way of talking about Haitians inside these migration systems is so powerful. And she's a real superstar when it comes to doing this work day in and day out.
Certainly, I think, for me, being able to put these events and then eventually the collection together brought to me this idea that, and I think is maybe something that I've tried to capture both in Strictly Facts, but also just broadly in my career as a scholar, that, the work that we're doing should not really live in a bubble, right? The fact that, as we've been discussing, right, bring together scholars, artists, creatives, nonprofits, student groups, because there were certainly student organizations on campus who were part of the work that we were doing. Bring all of these people together, I think, not only for the sake of, historicizing and documenting what we're calling migration studies, of course, for the book, but also more generally to really humanize the study. That it's not just, again, I feel like a kind of broken record at this point, but I think it was a major takeaway for me, right? That these violences are very important, very critical to the lives that people lead. And if we continue to talk about things in frameworks of numbers and, the worries of the state and all of these sort of capitalist ways of framing things, we negate these very lived and real experiences that are certainly part of and very much integral to not only, people's intentions or reasons for moving, but, why we have this thing called migration studies on a whole.
Kristen and Alexandra, you guys just made me realize that we have one major omission from the book. Now that we're going back to thinking about why didn't we have an article on food? Because we had this wonderful podcast that Kristen did with 5 migrant restaurateurs in Rhode Island. And, what food meant to them. Community was a very important aspect of that. And we even had, at the launch of the exhibition, we had food brought by these different restaurants. And food is such a crucial part of the migration story, right? It's so central. And just thinking it would have been so easy, but maybe the space would have been a limitation to have just brought those interviews.
Or maybe we just save it for
possible.
book 2, Dr. Lewis. You know, there's always that possibility as well.
Yeah, we kind of, this is just a start so that other people.
Well, I think we did find a great way to capture the work that we did on that podcast. Kennedy Jones, who was a grad student at the time in the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, she worked with a photographer and a team to create like an in-person experience that accompanied what now exists as a audio series online. So folks are welcome to check that out. I actually use it every time I teach my Latin America class, a kind of like intro to the region. I choose a couple of those podcasts for the end of class. And so my students get to keep listening to them. They're really cool stories, especially now that everybody's talking about Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. You can listen to the story of Milena Pagan in Little Sister, which like skyrocketed after I talked to her for that interview. They are living online, and really, really cool work that Kennedy Jones did to make this podcast series last and become a little bit more material.
Yeah, I also used that podcast in my undergraduate class on migration. And I also use it with articles on food. And, one of which is looking at the ways in which foods then become gentrified. If you want to say food can become gentrified or modernized, and we have some rich discussion about, why is it that Mexican food needs to be improved, so there are some interesting conversations that one can have around food when thinking about migration. There's something else we did. We also had exhibitions. Jasmine Govan's brilliant exhibition of her art, a Trinidadian artist. And her movement is from Jamaica. She's Jamaica. She studied and lived and worked in New York. Then she went back to Jamaica and then eventually went to Trinidad and is based in Trinidad and has the most incredible, started off as a jeweler and then ended up, with more sculpture. I mean, really elaborate and exquisite, really exquisite work. There's just so much when we think about migration. We can think about that goes beyond criminalizing people, othering people. I think that is what drove the project. And I think we've managed to capture some of that in the book.
Definitely. I did want us to hit on what I also find were a few key themes or major kind of through lines across some of the chapters. And for me, that would be like race or the racialization of migrants, belonging, and diaspora, which I think we all kind of throw diaspora as a word now. And it's true, like there is, I would say, like, Dr. Lewis, you and I are certainly part of the overarching Caribbean diaspora living in Rhode Island, for instance, right? But I think the way that we were able to sort of maybe complicate or tease out different definitions of those frameworks when it comes to migration, how do you all think we were able to sort of complicate those terms in general?
Alexandria, thanks for raising that question because there are two really interesting chapters in the book that, handle that theme. And both of them are focused on diasporas in the U.S. And that's Donette Francis's hegemonic whiteness and looking at how white Cubans in Miami have defined whiteness, what it means to be white, which is different from the kind of the American norm of what it means to be white. And tells you a lot that migrants, especially if they are in large numbers and are very well placed in a particular milieu, are able to change. This is not commenting on, what is not included, right? In that definition of whiteness and what it is pushing back against. But it's just the power of a diaspora to change strong existing norms. Then you have Lopez Oro, who looks at Garifuna in New York and raises the question of what happens when you migrate and you're no longer visible as part of the place you come from, which is Central America. So when you're in the diaspora, Central Americans don't think of Garifuna as being part of Central Americans when they think about Latin America. And then they're not visible as Black to African Americans. And how do you navigate that kind of liminal positionality from migration? Again, give you some of the different ways in which migrants either find a way to redefine, the places they end up at, or struggle to find an identity, right? Both a connection to the place they left as well as to the new place that they've come to. Yeah, I think those are two really interesting ways of thinking about race that, are kind of different from how we think about race, or different examples of how race operate.
Yeah, and those two chapters, they sit alongside the 4 other chapters in the first part of the book. We divided the book into 2 parts. In that first part, we also have the chapters that focus on interregional migrations, and also Monica DeHart's chapter about Chinese migration in Central America. I think that set of 6 chapters helps us to really focus on like racializing movements, racial formations that are happening because of migration all over the world. I think that we're used to thinking, and as Donna Francis's chapter tells us, we're used to thinking about racial formations happening in the global north, in the Anglo North, and she displaces that by thinking about those places, as especially Miami, as a place of triangulation. And I think that framework also lets us look at these other places of triangulation throughout the hemisphere and how they're producing these ways of seeing bodies. So like in Cecilia Rocha Carpiuk's chapter, she's talking about migrant workers, especially from Peru and Chile. And while she's not using a lot of racial language in her chapter, I think that when we sit it next to Donna Francis's idea of triangulation, like we can really think about what's happening in these other points of convergence throughout the hemisphere, and how people who like look different, who are eating differently, who are working differently, who are thinking about themselves differently, are producing these new theories of categorization, for better, for worse, throughout the hemisphere. And I think that's a really important contribution of the book, and something we really worked hard at doing, is what happens when we think of these frameworks next to each other, not just in terms of like putting these regions in conversation with each other, but using theories interchangeably throughout the chapters to think really critically about what migrants produce.
It certainly gets to our point on belonging, right? And how that functions differently depending on where you are. So, for instance, in Donette Francis's chapter, the conversation of belonging is vastly different from, say, Dr. Paul Lopez Oro's, because of the way that, as both of you uplifted for us, race and this triangulation of movement work differently in each locale. And so I think we're able to sort of tease out a different or maybe deeper understanding of, I think too often the conversation of migration becomes, you were not from here, right? You don't quote unquote belong here. And these are the sort of justifications of why the people who were quote unquote there originally feel this way or that way, right? We've been able to sort of change the scope of that based off, putting together these works to say that in certain places, people have created, like Miami, right, an environment where that sort of instance of belonging looks drastically different from what the quote unquote norm is. I think there are just a lot of ways, and I think maybe entanglements that we were able to bring together throughout this book. And that's why for me it was really a joy. And I think, as we've been talking and reflecting on it, having put this together 2021 to 2022, even now I won't say some of the things feel old, but it's interesting to see how things have changed, in the last 3 to 4 years since being able to have these conversations. And so I'll maybe turn that also to you. I think it's obviously a joy to see everything come together this way through our text, but how do you feel, since having these conversations 3 years ago, some of the things that we talked about then and some of the very critical discussions that were going on at the time have maybe shifted or even deepened since?
I think we had that anxiety when we were working on the book and just like how long these processes take, that maybe that these conversations like wouldn't hold up in a few years. I think our point is still the same: emphases on immigrants as criminal, as going from less developed to more developed places, as crisis, as all of these things. I don't think that that has shifted significantly. And so our major point with this work remains that we have to think differently. We have to think creatively, and like, especially through new collaboration, new synthesis, and like new perspectives. So I think like in that sense, unfortunately, this is like more relevant than ever. I think especially because if we're thinking about the way that media is representing migration right now, it's really kind of abysmal. And I think even in the best cases, we're only focusing on violence. And what this work is that we just focus on literally anything else. Through the same process of the seminar, I produced another article that isn't in this book, but that is about exactly that. If we only ever look at the violence of migration, like, we'll never see anything else about it. And I think anybody who is from an immigrant community, who lives any kind of migrant life, will tell you that there's so much more to their life than violence, like so much more to their community than suffering. And I don't think that anything about that conversation has been exhausted yet.
I also think we shouldn't overestimate the time that, and whether this is salient, because in 2023, which is really when the project ended, is when we invited authors to contribute, right? And they have not just given their conference presentations. People have done different things and had to make their chapters current. But even as we went along in the editorial process and coming towards right at the end, we asked again if people had any updates. So in terms of the specific cases that we present, I don't think that those are dated or there's anything dated there. But I think, Alexandra, what you're saying more is that the conversation around migration has intensified and has moved even more in the direction of crisis, And now, again, you see what we're doing? We're centering North America. We are centering North America because it sucks up all the air. And one of the things that we didn't pick up, but which is in Lostino's chapter, the whole issue of return migration, I think that will become huge as the U.S. keeps expelling people, and not just to territories of origin, but to places to which they have no connection, especially to the tiniest of places in the Caribbean and Latin America, to the English-speaking Caribbean, places with under 100,000 people, right? And one of the things we found, I think, in writing this, as much as we dissent to the US, we couldn't exclude the US completely because the US is so very implicated in migration, the story of migration in the region, which is why, we did manage to shift it from the border. But I think that increasingly it will be difficult to have any conversation about Latin America and the Caribbean without thinking of how the US, especially in the last few years, has upended migration systems across the region, has upended people's lives, how return migration would more than likely affect the places that migrants who have no connections to a country have been forcibly sent to. So I think that there's a lot more, and, unfortunately, again, we would have to be careful not to be totally swamped with all the negative stories, but to look for stories of possibility and hope, but also acknowledging how the ground on which migration, is occurring has shifted in such a dramatic and It's not unprecedented. Let's never say this is on what is happening or it's unprecedented, right? But definitely for our times, we can see a lot of the contradictions and the harms of these policies.
Want to shift gears a little bit, as Kristen said earlier, in terms of me being the culture girl, or I'll say culture scholar instead, because I think things just happen, and I think in a way that are kismet and just make sense. But the irony is certainly um, present to me that the book is coming out like basically a month after Bad Bunny's performance at the Super Bowl, and how I haven't done a whole episode on it. That's also maybe something on the horizon to do. But for me to sit and watch it, and also, of course, see the myriad of conversations that have transpired in its aftermath about culture, about Puerto Rico, about the unity and togetherness that was also displayed at the Super Bowl as he shouted out countries across Latin America and the Caribbean to show that, we are together in more ways that we're different, right? And so I always ask this of our listeners, but what are some of the ways that I think, and we've certainly talked about it in terms of food, in terms of the artists that have been a part of our conference and eventually the book. But what are some of the ways that you think, you know, culturally we have displayed these instances of migration, of belonging, of community togetherness that don't always get taken up in sort of the story about migration studies?
Alexandra, can I just comment on Bad Bunny?
Sure.
One of the things that has really interested me, and it speaks to the problem of having the Caribbean being seen as part of this region, and the whole focus on Latin America, that totally elides the Caribbean's presence, right? Is that, to his credit, Bad Bunny mentioned some English-speaking Caribbean countries when he was going up from the south all the way up to the north. He mentioned Guyana, he mentioned Antigua, he mentioned Jamaica, and all of the commentators I've heard, and I can't say that I listen to a wide range of media, right? But both in terms of people commenting on Bad Bunny in a positive way, as well as Latin American people here, and I don't want to mischaracterize people, who are commenting and being very positive about his mention of Latin America, totally missed the point about the Caribbean. They jump over the Caribbean, but of course, Cuba is the Caribbean as far as a lot of people are concerned, right? Maybe Haiti, but hardly ever the English-speaking Caribbean. So they talk about South, Central, and North America, and they totally, and I think that's one of the problems that, Caribbean scholars have been, we kind of anglicize the Caribbean. So when we speak about the Caribbean, we think of CARICOM with Haiti and Suriname, right? When Latin Americans think about the Caribbean, they think about Cuba and the Dominican Republic. And the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean is not really considered because Latin seems to be the thing. And I think that that's one of the things that our book really was trying to get around, to really try to be inclusive. This is our region. We have so many problems in common, and we're also very different. So it's not to homogenize us. There is no beauty in that. But just to recognize that sometimes, we have common challenges and we might have different experiences within that common challenge or experience. And I think we need more of that. We need more Bad Bunny to have a more open view of what this hemisphere is and where we can find solidarity.
And I think maybe bridging your question and Bad Bunny and Patsy's insights, like I said, the work that I do around immigration is based in Atlanta. And one really, really cool thing about working in any movement in Atlanta is the influence of civil rights struggle, like historically and contemporarily. And one thing that has always been a part of the work that we're doing, which could very easily focus on like Spanish speaking immigrants, because that is kind of the the skills that most of us that are involved with this work are bringing to the table, that we can speak Spanish. And so that's kind of skewing what we're able to do. But we've always been in conversation with groups who are thinking about the way that Blackness and anti-Blackness influence marginalization for immigrants. And so through being involved in these movements, like for years, I've been able to see the convergence of different sort of like interest-oriented groups coming together to talk about the ways that immigration enforcement affects people across races. And so that has been a way for like protest spaces, for fundraising spaces to be very mixed between what we normally think about as like Latin American and Caribbean separately, right? So there's food and there's music, and like as in most protest spaces, there's dance and art and all these things. And I think we're going to start to see more of that. And I think in even like a global way, when, the administration starts to target certain groups, those of us who have been organizing around other groups, we're going to show up. And so that only makes our spaces of resistance richer.
For me, it is food. I would say food. Trinidad has this wonderful dish called pastels, which is really Venezuelan origin. And of course, it's meat, but I have an aunt-in-law who made a vegan version that was just out of this world. Also, when I was growing up, we had people in my community who used to play the cuatro, which is actually, and to play parang, which is music, right? And I grew up with that on Christmas mornings, because we also had Venezuelan migrants to Grenada. But parang is very much a musical form that, is so typical of Trinidadian Christmas, right? A parang playing. And, so those are just two examples that come up, when you ask the question about what kind of influences I would see from Latin American migration to the Caribbean. That's what I think about.
I thought about it. I went the novel route this time. I usually go music, but I went novels this time. And I thought of, I mean, if we were to sit here and name novels on Caribbean, Latin American migration, we'd be here all day. But I think for me, some of the ones that really stuck out were Andrea Levy's Small Island, um, Jamaica Kincaid's Lucy, The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvett. I think, the list goes on, and I will be sure to add all of those to our Strictly Facts syllabus for our listeners tuning in. But I think, as we've all demonstrated, right, there are so many different avenues when it comes to culture that migration underscores and really uplifts and helps shape who these communities are, that they are written about, that they are points of activism, that they are just who we become when we evolve and come in contact with each other, as Dr. Lewis demonstrated through food. And so there are so many ways that I hope, our conversation helps to also demonstrate that for our listeners who may not even realize how integral these things come to the fore just in terms of our own lives.
Alexandra, reggaeton.
That too.
Reggaeton. We started in Panama with Jamaican migrants and their offsprings who listen to Jamaican radio,
Right.
and bring it back with their own influences, and then export it back out and adopt it by Puerto Rico. So people think it's Puerto Rican, right? But then we all get to enjoy it. So in a sense, it's that whole movement that we're seeing, from the Caribbean to Central America, from Central America to Puerto Rico, from Puerto Rico to the US, that I think is a lovely story about migration.
Having, known both of you all and gotten to work with you all, I know one of our definite interests and passions, I think, in putting this book together was that it be really accessible to a mass of people, right? Regardless of their work, their background, their understanding of migration, and that it's, accessible to not just scholars and students, right? But policymakers, community members. That was definitely an intention in the way that we crafted this. And so, with that intention in mind and, who this book hopefully speaks to, what do you hope that the variety of people walk away from this book with?
And there are so many amazing stories there, so many ways to understand people and their experiences that you will not get in the usual conversations that most of us have. And it's an insight into different lives, different ways in which people think of themselves, different challenges they have, or different, ways of expressing themselves that I'm hoping. And that opens up us to understanding, or at least being more open to understand difference and to appreciate it.
Absolutely that. And I think that there's also a lot of potential for people to, at the same time that they might see themselves in one of the stories that they read, because maybe it connects to something they study or something that they've lived or somebody that they know. I think that if they go on to read a second essay, they're going to learn something new. And that's how I felt when I was working on putting this volume together, is that as much as I felt like I really was part of certain conversations that were starting, I've spent almost no time thinking about the Dutch Caribbean as somebody who focuses on Central American migration. So I had that experience as I worked on it. And I think that's what I really hope, especially for students who are maybe reading this work as part of a class, or people who are like really immersed in one area of migration studies, that this will just like give a little window, a sort of welcome into thinking a little bit more broadly about their own work, their own interests, and their own lives.
I think for me, it was a few things. I think the general being that despite the differences put against us, right, or the ways that there are certainly, differences interregionally amongst us, there are so many similarities, and that's something that we draw out through this text together, that, being able to understand migration studies from this perspective helps us to create a broader narrative where there are certainly so many more commonalities. I also think, to me, help to underscore that there's so much work that still needs to be done. The ways that this came together, there were certain big takeaways that we wanted to definitely aim, right? I think some of those were in terms of course, the artistic celebration. We kind of also made a very pertinent description of how gender plays a role in migration as well. And you don't have to do this from a academic standpoint, of course, right? But the work that needs to be done is multi-tiered, multifold. And when we are able to sort of come together in these sort of communities, in these ways of understanding migration, who is impacted, how we are impacted, and what needs to be changed, it sort of definitely creates a a movement, for lack of a better way of framing, for us to have not only greater conversations, but to create definitely international change that is certainly needed at a time as such as now. Thank you both so much for joining me for this episode of Strictly Facts. I'm certainly fangirling a little bit. It's fun for me to do this because I'm usually fangirling over other people's books, but I was part of this one. So this was a nice change for our listeners. This was a tremendous experience for me, and great for it to be coming out as I am at the tail end of my graduate journey. So we're almost there. But for all of our listeners tuning in, Unbordering Migration Studies in the Caribbean and Latin America is out now. And so be sure to grab your copy. I will include a link to it on our show notes as always for you all to check out. And I think we also might have a promo code that's going out too. So be sure to use that to grab your copy and support the work that we are putting out. So thank you all for listening. Thank you, Dr. Lewis and Dr. Kolenz, for joining me for this episode.
Thank you so much, Alexandria.
Thanks for putting this together, Alexandra. Appreciate it.
Of course. Until next time, little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.